All right, what's going on, you guys? Nick here with Nick on the Power. I just wanted to do kind of a follow-up video on the 80s bodybuilding legend, Bob Paris. Now, Bob Paris isn't really that active on social media, but every once in a while he'll get on and answer some comments and questions on his page. And a lot of people have been sending me screenshots of this particular comment that he left recently. I believe it was last night, in reply to someone saying, "I believe that you deserve to win 2 to 3 Mr. Olympia Sandows. Your shape was perfect." Now, I did a video about Bob Paris about a month ago, talking about the fact that he was named the most aesthetic bodybuilder in history by Flex Magazine back in 2006, and that video did really well. And a lot of people do consider Bob Paris to be an uncrowned Mr. Olympia, but there's a lot of interesting things that he said in this particular comment that I want to break down in this video and kind of analyze the possibilities that he's talking about here. So Bob Paris's reply to this comment says, "Hey kiddo, thank you, but no worries. I got what I got. I only wish I clued in way earlier. Sometimes in life we chase ghosts for years and years beyond when the ghost should have dissipated. And I will declare this here and now. I should have won the 1984 and the 1985 Mr. Olympia. Only bigots and drug morons kept me from that. I accepted 7th and 9th because I'm a mensch and, at least back then, a team player. But I am planting this flag. I should have been Mr. Olympia in 1984 and 1985. Full stop." Now, this is a very profound comment from Bob Paris for several reasons. Number one, the most obvious reason, saying that he should have been Mr. Olympia in 84 and 85, probably the biggest statement he made in this comment, especially considering the fact that when you're talking about who won in 84 and 85, those were both years that Lee Haney won the Olympia. And as big of a fan as I am of Bob Paris, making the argument for Bob Paris over Lee Haney is a very, very tough argument. Now, the other part of this comment that I found was pretty profound is that only bigots and drug morons kept me from that. So this is a political statement about bodybuilding. This is a statement about how he was held back in placings because of the fact that he was an openly gay bodybuilder. This was a very big deal back in the 80s. He came out publicly during the peak of his competitive career, even talked about it on the Oprah show. So there's a lot of publicity and attention drawn to the fact that he was an openly gay bodybuilder. And at the time, he did receive a lot of backlash for that. He lost a lot of endorsements and sponsorships, and it was widely speculated that he was held back in placings because of his openness at the time. And there was also a lot of speculation that that was the reason he retired, was because of this, pushback that he got from the bodybuilding community, which is kind of ironic considering what bodybuilding is. So if anybody was wondering what Bob Paris thought of the climate and the attitude about the fact that he came out during that time, they don't have to wonder anymore, because he takes a very clear stance here that politics and bigotry in the sport was what was holding him back. Now, the other part of this comment that's fascinating is he also says drug morons kept me from that. Now, this is an even deeper and more fascinating part of this comment here. Drug morons. So Bob Paris was an advocate for natural bodybuilding. I do believe he claimed to be a natural bodybuilder. And like I said, he was a huge proponent for taking the natural route in bodybuilding. Now, I'm not going to get into whether or not I think Bob Paris was a natural bodybuilder. This is not a natty or not video. I think a lot of you guys are bodybuilding fans and can come to your own conclusion about whether or not Bob Paris was natural. But he does say drug morons kept him from winning the 84 and 85 Mr. Olympias. So assuming he's talking about his competitors that placed higher than him being on drugs, and him claiming to not have been on drugs, which is another very profound statement, which would be a video in and of itself. But I'm not going to get into that too deeply in this video. I want to mostly focus on the 84 and 85 Mr. Olympias, because he specifically says in this comment, I should have been Mr. Olympia in 84 and 85. So I want to look at the lineups in 84 and 85, Bob Paris's placings in 84 and 85, and whether or not he should have won or at least placed higher, because again, it's a very hard argument to make that Bob Paris should have beaten Lee Haney. I mean, Lee Haney, no doubt about it, was one of the most phenomenal bodybuilders in the history of bodybuilding. And again, it's a very, very tough argument to make for Bob Paris over Lee Haney. Now, I want to start with the 1984 Mr. Olympia, because this would be Bob Paris's best placing of all his Olympia appearances, taking 7th in 1984. And this lineup wasn't the deepest of the lineups that he's competed in. Lee Haney won that year, like I mentioned before. You had Muhammad Makawe in 2nd place, Jusup Wilcox in 3rd, Albert Beckles in 4th, Roy Callender in 5th, and Samir Bannout placing 6th ahead of Bob Paris. Now, to be completely honest with you, if you look back at the video of the top 6 at the 1984 Mr. Olympia, I think this is Bob Paris's strongest argument that he should have placed higher or at least won. Again, the Lee Haney thing is kind of hard to argue, but if you look at this top 6 video, the fact that Bob Paris was excluded from this top 6, I think is ridiculous. If you look at how Bob Paris looked in 84, he looked phenomenal. And I could see an argument for Bob Paris placing higher than every single guy in this top 6. With the exception of Lee Haney and Muhammad Makawe. I think these two guys looked especially phenomenal in 84. And I think they were a really solidified top 2 guys. Now, if you look at the Bob Paris posing video from 84, you can tell he looked phenomenal in 1984. And it does seem to me, by looking at this lineup, it was kind of a slap in the face that he took 7th in 84. I mean, I can see almost zero flaws with Bob Paris's physique. I mean, he wasn't the biggest guy on stage, but in 84, size really didn't matter. And all the things, aside from just being a big muscular guy, symmetry, aesthetics, proportion, conditioning, posing, Bob Paris nailed every single one of these on the list, but somehow still didn't crack that top 6. I think he was more symmetrical and proportionate than many of the guys in that top 6. And there certainly could be an argument that he was a top 3 guy, even an argument that he could have been 2nd at the 1984 Mr. Olympia. And I find this fascinating because this is a controversy that really you don't hear many people talking about. When you hear people talking about controversial Olympias, it's typically 1980, 1981, or even 2017. 1984 is an Olympia that you rarely hear brought up as a controversial one. Many people consider Lee Haney to have been a pretty definitive Mr. Olympia winner, and not many would argue with Lee Haney winning any of his Olympia titles. But I think when you look at this lineup again, you got Albert Beckles, Juice-Up Wilcaz, Roy Callender, these guys that were in the top 6. I just cannot see the rationale for Bob Paris not taking top 6 here. Then when you look at the fact that you had Muhammad Makawe in 2nd, you can see that the judges were looking for a smaller guy, a proportionate guy, a conditioned guy, a guy with fantastic posing. All the things that Muhammad Makawe exemplified, he was rewarded 2nd place for that. And Bob Paris exemplified all the same things, and he was a little bit bigger than Muhammad Makawe. So it's really hard to see why the judges had Bob Paris in 7th at this Olympia. So I would agree with Bob Paris that he was robbed in 1984. Now, 1985 is a different story. I think the 85 Olympia was a much more stacked lineup. You had guys, the top 6 was basically completely different in 85, and Bob Paris took 9th here, so he moved down 2 placings, and after 1985, his placings would only get worse. I think 10th, 12th, and 14th in the Olympias that would follow. But 85, I feel, was a much deeper Olympia, and the top 6 was much better. You had Albert Beckles moving up to 2nd, and Muhammad Makawe moving down to 4th. Then you had Rich Gaspari in the mix for top 3, Mike Christian in 5th, the legendary Barry DeMay in 6th. You had Tom Platz coming in 7th. You had Sergio Oliva making his comeback, coming in 8th. There were some legends in the 85 lineup. There's no doubt about that. But then on the other hand, when you look at Bob Paris's posing routine from the 85 Olympia, some say this was one of the best posing routines that Bob Paris ever had. Now, when I look at it, I see a bigger version of Bob Paris, and I think his conditioning was better the year prior in 84. So I think the reason that he moved down a couple placings was, in fact, the conditioning. Based on what I can see, it looks like he tried to come in bigger in 85 and was not rewarded for that. However, again, you've got to look at the aesthetics, the proportions, the symmetry of a guy like Bob Paris and compare it to the guys that were in the top 6, and you just really can't see the rationale for why he would place as low as 9th in 1985. It does really seem like a slap in the face. It's not like Bob Paris came in completely off. He came in a little bit bigger for sure, but he was still very conditioned. He was still in incredible shape, and his posing routine was still fantastic. And you had smaller guys like Rich Gaspari coming in 3rd, and even though Bob Paris was a smaller guy by the standards of that time, I still think the aesthetics of Bob Paris were greater than the aesthetics of a guy like Rich Gaspari, no disrespect. And then Albert Beckles, who I believe is one of the oldest bodybuilders to ever take 2nd at the Olympia. I think you could make a strong argument for Bob Paris's physique over his. Then Muhammad Makawe not coming in as sharp. I think you could make an argument for Bob Paris over him. But overall, the question at hand is, do I believe that Bob Paris should have won the 84 and 85 Mr. Olympias? No, I don't. But do I think that Bob Paris, his placings were affected by possible bigotry and politics in the IFBB? I absolutely do believe that. I think the placings that he received were extraordinarily low for the physique that he brought, especially considering the era he was in, the 80s. He had like the ideal physique for an 80s bodybuilder. So it's just really hard to rationalize why he would place 9th at an Olympia and not make the top 6 at an Olympia ever. We're just talking about 2 Olympias in this video. He never placed top 6 at the Olympia at any point in his career. And you're going to tell me that his physique was not a top 6 Olympia physique in the 80s? No, there's no chance. I mean, this guy certainly deserved to be a top 6 guy at the Olympia. There's no question in my mind. And do I believe politics played a factor? Absolutely, yes. Now, I want to know what you guys think in the comment section below. Do you think Bob Paris was robbed in 1984 and 1985? But I think the more interesting discussion that I want to see in the comment section below is, do you believe Bob Paris was natural throughout his professional bodybuilding career? Because that is what he's implying with the comment that he left. So let me know in the comment section below. Please give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Nick Strength and Power, signing out.